Have you ever wondered why you want anything? I mean, really wondered. Why do you want to build something? Why do you want to win? Why do you want to create? Why do you want to be admired? Why do you get angry when something isn't right? Why do you feel attraction? Why do you want intimacy? Why does music sometimes make something come alive inside of you? Why can one person walk into a room and suddenly your entire body knows they're there? Where does all that come from? We usually divide these things into categories. You know, ambition over here, anger over there, creativity somewhere else, sexual desire. We definitely put that one in its own locked room. Spiritual longing gets another category altogether. But what if they're not as disconnected as we think? What if underneath many of them is something more fundamental? Desire. A kind of fire inside of us that says move, reach, create, connect, protect, love, become. And here's the question I want to wrestle with today. Who lit the fire? And maybe even more importantly, what is it for? Welcome to Crusade With Me. The truth is worth seeking. So let's seek it. Something in us wants to move. Think about a newborn baby. Nobody teaches that baby to desire. A baby enters this world wanting warmth, food, touch, comfort, connection. Before that child understands language, morality, religion, achievement, money, politics, or social status, desire is already there. It's like life reaches outward. And that continues throughout our lives. We want to explore. We want to learn. We want relationships. We want accomplishment. We want pleasure. We want meaning. We want to matter. Sometimes when we even want things that aren't good for us, right? Christianity has sometimes been presented as though the great spiritual project is learning how to stop wanting. Don't desire too much. Don't enjoy too much. Don't feel too much. Control yourself. Behave. And certainly, Don't trust your body. But I begun wondering whether that starts the conversation in the wrong place. You see, because if God created human beings, then he created beings capable of desire. Genesis doesn't begin with human beings as disembodied spirits floating around contemplating God. God forms humanity from the dust of the ground, then breathes into that creature the breath of life. Dust, breath, body, spirit. And suddenly the dust is alive. It moves. It hungers. It creates. It loves. It desires. Maybe desire itself isn't the enemy. Maybe the question is, where is the desire taking us? Fire can give us a useful picture. Fire can warm your house, can cook your food, shape steel, it can power an engine, can light the darkness, or it can burn everything you love to the ground. The problem isn't that fire exists. The question is whether the fire has a proper place and whether somebody is tending it. So here's some questions I've been pondering, and I want you to ponder too. What desires seem to have been built into human beings? Here's another one. Are our strongest desires automatically sinful simply because they're powerful? How about this? What if spiritual maturity isn't learning to extinguish the fire? So that leads to this. What if it's learning what the fire is for? In my mind, I feel like we have been taught two bad options. I think modern life gives us two primary ways of dealing with desire. And strangely enough, they are opposites. The first is suppress it. Don't feel it. Don't acknowledge it. Push it down. Pretend it isn't there. And quite frankly, religious communities can become very good at this. You're angry? Don't be angry. You're attracted to somebody? Stop thinking about it. You're ambitious? Be more humble. You're struggling? Smile and tell everybody you're blessed. The problem isn't that pretending something doesn't exist, make it disappear. Sometimes it simply sends it underground. But our culture offers another answer. Indulge it. If you feel it, it must be authentic. If you want it, pursue it. If it gives you pleasure, why deny yourself? Your desires define you. Follow your heart. Let's be honest, that doesn't seem to work out very well either. Because anyone who has lived long enough to know that the human heart can want contradictory things. I can want to lose 20 pounds and still want another oatmeal cream pie, okay? I can want financial security and want to buy something stupid on Amazon. I can love my wife deeply and still be capable of selfishness. I can want peace while feeding my anger. So maybe there's a third option. Not suppression, not indulgence. How about this? Formation. Understand the desire. Discipline it. Then direct it toward the good. That's very different. Suppression says, don't feel it. Indulgence says, if you feel it, satisfy it. Formation says, understand it, discipline it, and direct it toward the good. And suddenly, self-control means something different too. Self-control isn't necessarily God's way of keeping us from pleasure. Maybe self-control is what keeps pleasure from becoming our master. That's a very different picture of God, and a very different picture of ourselves. The body knows things before the mind does. Here's where it gets interesting to me. We like to imagine ourselves as thinking creatures who occasionally have bodily experiences. But increasingly, science is showing us how deeply interconnected all of this is. Because breathing changes our heart rate. Heart rate affects emotional states. Stress changes digestion. Touch changes brain chemistry. Exercise changes mood. Sexual arousal affects attention and motivation. Sleep changes judgment. Fear can be felt in your chest before your conscious mind has even figured out what you're afraid of. Ancient people didn't have MRI machines. They didn't understand neurotransmitters. They couldn't measure heart rate variability. But they knew something modern people sometimes forget. You're not merely a brain carrying around a body. You are an embodied human being. And Scripture is surprisingly comfortable with that. Breath matters. Food matters. Touch matters. Rest matters. Marriage matters. Sex matters. Bodies matter. Jesus himself doesn't merely teach ideas. He touches people. He eats with people. He weeps. He sleeps. He becomes tired. He experiences anguish. And he celebrates. Truly, Christianity makes an absolutely staggering claim. God entered human flesh. Not merely human consciousness. Flesh. Which should make Christians very cautious about treating the body as though it's some embarrassing obstacle to spirituality. And this is where I have found some ancient Eastern practices interesting. Not because I think every ancient claim is true, I'm going to be clear, and certainly not because something becomes true simply because it's old. I do believe that the truth is worth seeking, so test it. Test breathing practices, meditation, slow movement, attention to the body. Different traditions developed ways of describing what they experienced, sometimes using concepts like chi or life energy. Do we have to accept every explanation? No. Okay, I want to be clear. But neither should we dismiss an experience merely because somebody outside our tradition noticed it first. If controlling breathing affects the nervous system, that's true whether a Daoist discovered it or a Lutheran does. Truth doesn't become dangerous because somebody else noticed it. Creation belongs to God. And if something is real, we ought to be willing to examine it. All right, let's cut to the chase here. Scurry the children out of the room. What about sexual energy? So now we have to talk about walk through that door that everybody knew was eventually coming. Sex. Because sexual desire may be one of the clearest examples of what we're talking about. It is extraordinarily powerful. It can motivate people, or distract people, or bond people, or destroy people. It can create families. It can break families. It can produce tremendous intimacy. And likewise, it can produce tremendous suffering. And quite literally, it can create another human being. That is some serious fire. Christianity has historically placed boundaries around sexuality. And there may be a very good reason for those boundaries. And we're going to explore that. But before we ask where the boundaries are, I want to ask something more basic. Why is this desire so powerful in the first place? If God designed human physiology, then he didn't accidentally make sex pleasurable. The human nervous system didn't sneak that feature past him. And particularly when we look at female sexuality, things become fascinating. Think about it. A woman's sexual response isn't required for conception. For those who say that's the whole purpose of sex, is to procreate. Think about that. From a purely mechanical standpoint, reproduction could occur without a female orgasm. Yet the female body possesses an extraordinary capacity for sexual pleasure. Why? Now, let me be clear. That's not an argument for unrestricted sexual behavior. It's simply a question worth asking. And I think Christians ought to be brave enough to ask it. Because sometimes we've been so concerned about preventing sexual sin that we barely stop to ask, what is sexuality actually for? Obviously, reproduction is part of the answer. Bonding seems to be part of the answer. Intimacy, pleasure, vulnerability, trust, union. Perhaps even something about learning to give rather than merely take. Genesis gives us this strange phrase: the two became one flesh. Maybe that's bigger than biology. And if sexual desire is a fire, perhaps God's intention was never simply to extinguish it. Maybe it was meant to be tended, directed, protected. And shared in a way that causes something greater than momentary pleasure to emerge. Which means the Christian sexual question cannot simply be, what am I forbidden from doing? A better question might be, what was this tremendous power created to accomplish? Jesus doesn't destroy desire. He reorders it. Eventually all these questions bring me back to Jesus. Because look at the people Jesus encounters. He meets ambitious people, fearful people, angry people, greedy people, sexually broken people, powerful people, desperate people, people hungry for status, people hungry for love. And he rarely treats them as though the solution is simply becoming less human. Instead, he redirects them. You want greatness? Fine. Become the servant. You want treasure? Fine. Seek treasures that cannot decay. You hunger and thirst? Good. Hunger and thirst for righteousness. You want life? Then lose the false life you've been clinging to. You want to lead? Wash feet. Again and again, Jesus doesn't merely say, stop wanting. He changes the object of desire. He reorders love. And maybe that's one of the greatest purposes of spiritual formation. Not becoming a person without passion, becoming a person whose passions have learned where home is. You know, there's this beautiful line in the Psalms. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. We sometimes hear that as, love God, and eventually he'll give you everything you want. But what if it's deeper than that? What if delighting in God gradually changes what you want? The desires themselves become transformed. The fire remains. But now it illuminates instead of destroys. Maybe that's what Paul was getting at when he talks about the fruit of the Spirit. You know, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and then self-control. Notice what isn't on the list. Numbness, apathy, passionlessness. The goal isn't becoming less alive. Maybe holiness is becoming fully alive without being enslaved by what makes us feel alive. That's worth thinking about. But this leaves us with a question that Christians sometimes seem almost uncomfortable asking. If God created pleasure, why did he make some pleasure so incredibly powerful? And nowhere is that question more obvious than sex. Why does sexual pleasure reach so deeply into the human brain and body? Why does intimacy affect us emotionally? Why does touch matter? Why does orgasm feel the way it does? And here's the question I've been thinking about most. Why did God make sex feel so good? Seriously. He didn't have to. Reproduction could have been mechanical, functional, almost boring. But it isn't. Why? What does human physiology tell us? What does Scripture actually say? What have Christians gotten right about sex? What might we have misunderstood? And what happens when we compare ancient wisdom, modern neuroscience, human experience, and the biblical story without being afraid of where the evidence leads us? That's where we're going to go on our next episode. So where does this fire inside of you come from? I don't think we can completely answer that in one episode. Biology plays a role. Hormones definitely play a role. Nervous systems play a role. Experience plays a role. Culture plays a role. And I believe something even deeper is happening. We are creatures made by a creator who gave us the capacity to desire, to create, to work, to fight for what matters, to seek, to touch, to love, to unite, to experience pleasure, to become. The fire isn't automatically good simply because we feel it. But neither is the fire automatically evil because it's powerful. Maybe the task isn't extinguishing it. Maybe the task is learning how to tend it. Because uncontrolled fire definitely destroys. But fire properly ordered gives warmth, light, energy, life. And maybe that's part of what following Christ actually looks like. Not becoming less human, not becoming numb, not being ashamed that we're creatures with bodies and passions and desires, but bringing all of that into the light, testing it, understanding it, disciplining it, and allowing Christ to teach us what every part of us was actually created for. Maybe the question isn't, how do I get rid of this fire? Maybe the question is, what would happen if this fire became ordered toward love? That's a question worth seeking. Because the truth is worth seeking. This has been Crusade with me. We're not here because we already have every answer. We're here because the questions matter and because I believe truth can withstand being questioned. So this week, pay attention to the fire. What makes you angry? What makes you excited? What do you crave? What makes you feel alive? Don't immediately condemn it. Don't immediately obey it. Notice it. Then ask, what is this desire trying to tell me? Where is it trying to take me? And what would it look like to direct it towards something good? Next time, we're taking this conversation somewhere Christians don't always like to go. We're going to ask, Why did God make sex feel so good? And we're not going to settle for an easy answer. So until then, keep asking questions, keep seeking truth, keep picking them up and putting them down, and as always, continue to crusade with me.